you by The Point. I'm Li Xin. In this series, I dissect stories that are making headlines around the world and talk to my guests to compensate for the missing pieces of the puzzle. So join us in real time by sending us your comments or questions via the CGTN page on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube or Weibo. If you're watching this live on the CGTN application, email me at thepointwithlx@cgtn.com. Let me know what you think. We live stream Headline Buster on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Beijing time and air the segment on TV at 11:30 a.m. on Fridays. So do join us during the live streaming and get in touch. We would love to receive and possibly read out your insightful comments. First, a climate quiz. How many cars does a US president need in his motorcade to talk about the environment and other issues? And the answer? 85. Yes, that's the number US President Joe Biden reportedly had when he met with the Pope in Rome last week. Imagine the carbon footprint he left, and the double irony was that this happened right before he flew to Scotland to attend the UN Climate Change Conference. Leading by example, indeed. Let's now look at the optics of COP26, especially the media focus, or shall we say, the media obsession. The two-week-long meeting has brought nearly 190 countries and 30,000 delegates together to speed up action on the 2015 Paris Agreement. The aim is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has emphasized how urgent the task is.
The 6 years since the Paris Climate Agreement have been the 6 hottest years on record. Our addiction to fossil fuels is pushing humanity to the brink. We face a stark choice. Either we stop it or it stops us. And it's time to say, enough. Enough of brutalizing biodiversity. Enough of killing ourselves with carbon. Enough of treating nature like a toilet. Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
A report released at COP26 by the World Meteorological Organization says global sea level rise accelerated to a new high in 2021 with continued ocean warming and acidification. But media headlines seem obsessed with other things. A bitter rivalry, a suicide pact, and a supervillain. No prizes here for guessing who that supervillain is. China, of course. Even before COP26 started, the headlines wondered if Chinese President Xi Jinping would attend in person. Then they threw a tantrum on learning he would only send a written statement and said COP26 would fail due to his absence, and then finally found faults with the statement. A headline in The Standard goes, which world leaders are attending the climate summit and who's snubbing it? Did China snub it, meaning to ignore the meeting disdainfully? The Anglo-Saxons invented the English language, but they don't have the right to abuse it. There was little expectation anyway that President Xi would attend. He has by now made announcements about China's climate change commitments 3 times this year. So basically, his physical absence should not be the only thing that matters. This headline made so much ado about nothing, to borrow from Shakespeare. And this New York Times headline is not much more sophisticated either. Who's attending? Biden and Modi, and who isn't? Putin and Xi. What is it trying to tell us? At the end of the day, what really makes a difference to climate change? Attending one meeting or implementing what you have promised? President Biden was at COP26 for 3 days out of 13, but how much clout does he have, even at home, to make a difference? Even some of his fellow Democrats have failed to support a spending package that includes over $500 billion to reduce emissions. He had wanted to have the deal in the bag, to have something to flaunt in Glasgow, but no, he was there. The money wasn't. Besides the obsession with who will be there and who will not, some media seem keen on drumming up conflict, especially a deadly China-US climate rivalry, and blaming China for the failure of COP26 even before it started. Like this Bloomberg report, China-US rivalry is the big threat to any climate pact. The report describes the two countries as rivals in everything, from space to artificial intelligence to racing for bottom spot in climate change action. The writer even wonders whether this rivalry will lead to a climate suicide pact. Yes, you heard it right, a climate suicide pact. Wow, that's some Shakespearean imagination at work. And more imaginative reporting follows that China's economy is faltering, despite the IMF has estimated 8% growth this year for the country, and that China is sending out fleets of red trucks full of coal to trigger more emissions, and Beijing's emission control plan is a disappointment with few details. Now, exactly how does China's emission control plan look like? Let's see. By 2030, share of non-fossil fuels in energy consumption is to increase to 25% from less than 16% in 2020. Carbon intensity is to drop by more than 65% compared to 2005 levels, and China will not build any more new coal-fired power plants abroad. I can go on, but you can see how detailed the plan actually is. In fact, some have said it is too detailed. But there is one detail which has rarely been picked up: finance for developing countries to tackle climate change. In 2009, at COP15 held in Copenhagen, developed nations finally agreed to channel $100 billion per year by 2020 to help developing nations mitigate climate change. How have developed countries honored their commitment? An OECD assessment published this September shows that although climate finance grew slightly in 2019, developed countries remain $20 billion short of the goal. OECD Secretary General Matthias Cormann said the limited progress is disappointing, particularly ahead of COP26. Isn't that where the focus should be, instead of targeting China for not making new pledges? How about honoring one's own pledge before fingering others? But in fairness, one article I came across does get the point. It's this Time report titled "Economic Growth and Carbon Emissions Used to Go Together. In Some Countries, That's Changing." It says developed countries got rich by burning fossil fuels for almost 200 years. Their emission levels dropped not always because they took positive steps, but because something had gone wrong, such as the Great Depression or the Second World War. Wealthy countries still contribute much more per capita to global emissions, and they still bear much greater responsibility for the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over the last 200 years. So their emissions cuts will need to be greater for the world to reach net zero. Now compare this with China. Developed countries generally set a time frame of 40 to 70 years to move from carbon peaking to carbon neutrality, while China has given itself just 30 years. With China being the world's factory and now going out through the Belt and Road Initiative, it is fighting climate change on multiple fronts. Is it ethical for some media to repeatedly shame developing countries such as China and India by calling them the worst polluters and trying to push them to do even more? When on Monday, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi mentioned India's pledge to reach carbon neutrality by 2070, the media called it ridiculous. Why? Because it seemed far behind the goal set by rich nations. As you think about that, it's time for a break. We'll be back to see the latest progress at COP26 and where China stands regarding them. Stay with us, and I'll also have three distinguished guests joining us. Welcome back to Headline Buster. I'm pleased to be joined by three guests. They are Dr. Alexander Fischer, who is Director for Sino-German Cooperation on Climate Change of GIZ China, Professor Qi Ye, Director of Institute for Public Policy of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and Professor Howard Bamsey, Chair of Global Water Partnership of the Australian National University. Gentlemen, welcome to Headline Buster. First of all, let me go to Dr. Fischer. We are 5 days into COP26. What kind of progress do you assess has been made, and what are the difficult topics that are being debated in Glasgow up to now?
Thank you so much, Liu Qin, for the opportunity to join and for having me. It's a great pleasure. We are 5 days in the COP26, as you mentioned. I understand that the pledges which has been made, if they all are implemented, we would end up at the 1.9 degree Celsius global warming, which is below the 2-degree target. So from that point of view, I think the world's leaders are on track with their announcement. Of course, COP is not the place to implement. It's a place for announcement, for paperwork, for wording, for negotiation. But I think this is quite remarkable, despite the tensions which you mentioned earlier in your moderation.
Professor Chi, how do you assess the progress so far at COP26, and what is the biggest sticking issue here?
I think the progress has been fine. The main task for the negotiators this time is to complete the rule book for the Paris Agreement. And this including, of course, the Article 6 and other issues. And finance, we have seen we're not going to achieve the finance target until 2023. On the other hand, and some important progress has been made on reducing 30% of methane between the 2020 and 2030. I think that is a very significant progress. And we have heard some other major countries like India and made their commitment for carbon neutrality by 2070. This is very, very important. I think the overall spirit is let's just consolidate the consensus on climate neutrality or carbon neutrality, and we go from there. This is the consensus itself. Is very, very important. We have seen this emphasized by President Xi and other world leaders. Let's leave the divisive issues out and let's focus on the consensus and consolidate it and make very concrete progress.
Professor Benzi, do you see progress being made that countries are trying to leave the divisive issues out and working and pushing forward the consensus, and especially how to implement it?
Well, I think so far in the COP, that's exactly the case. And I think you'd expect that from the first couple of days, which have been the leaders' summit. You would expect and hope to see the momentum gaining speed as leaders pledge their commitment to respond to climate change. So I think we've seen a very successful start to the COP. There are now some details to be worked through, and the diplomatic negotiations will commence. I hope that we see through the rest of the COP that the consolidation, the sense of common purpose that's been so evident in the first few days, I hope that that's maintained.
Professor Chi, what is your impression of what you have read from professional information providers vis-a-vis the mass media? Is the mass media doing a good job at conveying the kind of hard work and the atmosphere that is really at COP26 vis-a-vis the kind of sensational headlines that they're throwing out?
Well, I think every good story must have a context, and that's the media's job to make the public understand the context and the real content. But on the other hand, we are now living in a post-truth world, and unfortunately, and we have seen some media, and including some professional media and social media, they're trying to catch the eyeballs, and I understand, and I'm not, I'm not agreeing to that kind of approach. On the other hand, I think the professionals are the professionals, and they are trying to do a good job. And I hope the professionals, all come out and directly face to the public and explain what's going on and make the real story heard.
Professor Benzi, what is the kind of narrative that's being pushed on media in Australia, for instance, about COP26? Is it about the real issues that have to be tackled, or is it more about, rivalry, geopolitics, and attracting people's eyeballs?
Well, I think, Liu Xin, that it's in Australia, it's probably pretty similar to elsewhere, and the short answer is all of the above. I think I've been speaking to many reporters in the last week or so, and they've captured a spectrum from very detailed, precise knowledge and astute questions about the key issues. Right through to one reporter asking me, why is the COP important? So it's, there's a spectrum and there's a great variety of reporting, and many of the reporters have been following climate change for a long time. Many are brand new to it, and some are serious and some really are about headlines. So I think there's a great variety.
Let's look at the specific issue, which I think is quite important, which is the funding for developing countries to mitigate the effects of climate change. As I said, there is a $20 billion shortage to the $100 billion that is pledged on an annual basis. Dr. Fisher, exactly what is the problem here? Is this lack of will, lack of resources? Why the reluctance?
Thank you for that question. Also not easy one, but very important. I think it's a little bit of a catch-22. On the one hand, the donor countries, if you want to call it that way, the developed world, who are pledged to provide this funding, in their perspective, they do what they can and convince their population that their tax money has to be used to help developing countries to transition to a low-carbon economy, and how important it is also for the constituencies. They explain what they do with the tax money. And on the other hand, you pointed it out, the money needed for the transition in developing countries, Mr. Modi made his point yesterday, are so immense and enormous. This cannot be only funded by tax money alone anyway. So the private sector, the banks, the finance system, the large investors in the world are supposed to team up to fill this funding gap. And I think, especially in the COP26 now in Glasgow, we see a certain momentum, this really happening.
Professor Chi, your assessment of the reasons behind the funding not being able to catch up its goal so far?
Well, first of all, I agree with Dr. Fisher that the funding, from public sources is not adequate. It's not enough to address such a big, huge challenge, the greatest challenge to humanity. On the other hand, we need to separate the public funding and the private funding. The public funding, which was committed in 2009 at Copenhagen, that has never been delivered, not going to be delivered until at earliest 2023. At this moment, I think it's a very typical issue of collective action. Everybody count on others to fulfill the commitment to deliver the goals, and while they want to be the free riders, I think that is a very typical of a lack of a political will. This is something I think the developed countries must come out and make that to honor their own commitment. On the other hand, private sources are very, very important, maybe even more important. This is why we see the sustainable green finance, sustainable finance, climate finance that need to play a very, very big role. And also in the last couple of years, we have seen the developing countries are not waiting for the money from the developed countries. They are doing themselves to help each other by setting up this South cooperation on financing and capacity building. I think we need all these efforts to work together. We can't wait. I mean, the bottom of the truth is we cannot wait for this, and we have to move forward.
Professor Benzi, if you think about it, I mean, $100 billion for all of the developed countries is not that much, but why so difficult?
I think we can see in Glasgow already that the momentum we've been talking about earlier in relation to pledges for emissions reductions is also a feature of the financing discussion. So in the last couple of days, we've seen number of countries announce increases in their climate finance, including Japan, which is doubling. Australia has doubled its climate finance. And in fact, I think the latest assessment I saw was that even those announcements of the last few days would see the $100 billion a year commitment met in 2022. So yes, it's not done in 2020, but it's just a couple of years off. I think you can see that glass as half empty, or you can see it as half full. And I think it does represent, in general, a strong commitment from developed countries to deliver. And they will deliver, I'm confident. Now, I agree with Professor Chi, that's not enough. We need more, and there will be more. But I do think what we're seeing is that the public finance that's coming forward is indeed stimulating private investment. And those two working together will continue to create further momentum, I think. And as the investment climate for climate-friendly activity continues to improve, and governments begin to adjust their incentives so that that's the smart money will increasingly go to climate-friendly activity, I think we'll see that finance will not be lagging long, and that it will become available as required for the important task, the vital task of changing the direction of investment around the world to support the climate response.
Yeah. Let's take a look at two comments we have received so far. Let me read them out to you. The first one says, we had Rio, Kyoto, Paris, and now Glasgow. What was achieved? Never mind, Liu Xing, as you rightly pointed out, we have to deal with climate change now and soon before we do not have a place to live. So this is one comment. The next one. It's hard to trust promises from the US. It's common in Western countries for government lines to be volatile and market sensitive. China, on the other hand, has the habit of fulfilling its promise. So basically, we're looking at two issues here. I'm going to ask each of my guests to comment on these comments. Dr. Fisher, you first. Basically, what has been achieved, right? Some people seem to have a great sense of distrust or pessimism as to all of these meetings, COP26 by now. What has been achieved? Should we lose our heart? And secondly, you know, the kind of commitments, especially for developed countries, whether they're able to uphold.
Thank you, Lucien, pointing this out, and Mr. Hong to ask these questions. It's good to put it into perspective, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Glasgow. And when I was in the German government and attended the COP meetings, I also, of course, asked my questions. What are we going to achieve through these meetings? Isn't it sort of just a big fuss and thousands of people meeting and flying around the world, making extra emissions? Will it actually pay off? After deeply learn the importance of this gathering and how this shows the world that this is happening, I changed my mind into, well, actually, I think there cannot be enough people who are working on the subject, and as more as better. For example, I'd like to bring the example from the Arndt Group, who set up the social media network on rescuing the forest, where 500 million signed up. So I think there cannot be enough, and these meetings may look not very helpful for the individual choices we make every day. Do I buy an electric car? Do I buy a fossil fuel car? Do I take the next plane? Do I install a solar panel on my roof? Of course, these are far away from my individual decisions. So I totally understand Mr. Hong's frustration about this. But at the end of the day, it will trickle down, and China and Europe and also the US, they all moving in that direction to transition the whole economy in all our lives, while each individual decision also matters. So my advice is, don't get frustrated and start by yourself, and then I think we're all gonna get there.
Yeah. Professor Chi, your comments, and I also want to hear what you say about the kind of capability to fulfill promises, right? Every country is making promises for themselves, and what are the complexities and what are the different situations different systems have? For instance, in the United States, we have President Joe Biden being very much hindered by the kind of disagreement, right, between parties and even within his own party, whereas in China, it seems that China is able to push forward the goals that it sets for itself, but not without challenges.
I have been a long critic of the climate governance overall. I think there considerable room to improve. For instance, we do not really need 30,000 people to go to Glasgow for this big conference and to make a real progress, especially during this big pandemic right now. And on the other hand, I do realize the political reality. There are so many barriers, obstacles need to overcome. You just mentioned in the United States, the political system, and the president serves for 4 years, and it's really hard to make any real progress during that short period of time. And you do need a bipartisan cooperation to pushing these issues, and when there is a big fight, and you have real trouble. And we realize all these difficulties and challenges. We'll also need to realize this is by far the biggest challenge to human beings, to test whether or not we can actually, all nations, all people can actually get together to face and address these huge challenges. And I think this is not time to, finger pointing at each other right now. And I agree with Dr. Fisher, and we understand the frustration, but we need to move on. And when your boat, we're all in the same boat. When your boat is broken, the leaking water, and we have to keep pedaling, and we have to move forward while trying to fix all the problems. I think this is a political reality we're facing, and while there is no better system, no better ways to fix it, let's just work in good faith and fix the problems.
Professor Benzie, I'm going to leave you with the opportunity to do the concluding remarks here.
Well, I agree with my colleagues. I think we have no option but to continue. Where we are, this is a task for all of us, all of humankind. So, 加油.
Thank you very much. I didn't expect that. So with that, we are going to wrap up this edition of Headline Buster. Many thanks to my three guests: Alexander Fisher, Director for Sino-German Cooperation on Climate Change of GIZ China; Professor Chi Ye, Director of Institute for Public Policy of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology; and Professor Howard Benzie, Chair of Global Water Partnership of Australian National University. Indeed, let's 加油. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of Headline Buster. Many thanks for having been with us. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. I'll see you in the next Headline Buster.